It's great to have you all here, and you can actually feel the energy in the room for tonight's conversation. As you entered the room, you received a little card. That was not for you to write down your favorite recipe. Instead, please write whatever questions you have, and we have people on staff collecting along the aisles, and we'll get to that in the second half of the program. Also, while you were asked to silence your phones, Michael has asked that you not turn them off, and has requested that you tweet as much as you want during the program.
It worked for some people, doesn't it?
At Kosher Soul. Kosher Soul. And we'll hear about it. So, Laura talked about mishpacha, and the cooking gene has a whole chapter entitled that. But this is not a book about familial bliss. The family that Michael describes is a dysfunctional one.
Yes.
The cooking gene was written as a means of healing racial wounds caused by slavery, as well as to honor the accomplishments of the formerly enslaved. He seeks to achieve this by tracing and ultimately reclaiming the historical origins of Southern cuisine. Michael writes and speaks passionately about sociopolitics of food, racial distinctiveness, and the appropriation of African American culture. And his Jewish identity is a lens through which he has developed his Black identity. Michael's family tree, which should be scrolling along over here, which you can see, is a powerful statement in itself of the particular and the universal. It's both Michael's unique lineage, which he can trace all the way back to the early 1700s, and literally tens of thousands of others across 6 continents also share these same genes. Michael writes that he loves being human, and the family tree is about keeping faith in humanity. The cooking gene is part research, part genealogical study, and part spiritual storytelling. Michael has likened the process of writing this book to making challah, by braiding and letting it rise, with hope of bringing different kinds of people together to get them talking with each other rather than at one another about how food has shaped them and how they have shaped their food. So with that, Michael, why do you think food is such a powerful medium for storytelling and for deepening identity and for bringing people together?
Because your truth comes out with your food. Everything's a couple years ago when you turned 40. Some time ago, this person, before I knew what trolling was, said, food is just fuel, nothing more. That's the biggest lie ever. Because if you want to understand who you are, go to a place you're not familiar with, then eat a plate of the food, or at least look at it. You'll quickly find out who you are, what your boundaries are, what you're willing to accept, what you're willing to give up. And those walls dissolve the minute we encounter each other's plates, or those walls are built when we encounter each other's plates. It's a distinction. For example, I will never love Dr. Brown's celery. Gefilte fish will always remain a vehicle for eating horseradish. It just.
How about the jelly?
No, God forbid. But when, I wrote an article about picha. See that scattered laughter? That told whose generation you come from. Because the young people who don't know what picha is real Jewish soul food. Picha is calf's foot jelly. Yeah. And the only reason you eat it is because of the fact you put so much onion and garlic in it. That's the only reason you eat it. So for me, that tells the whole story. But in terms of food, we have this myth of these divided lines. But it's quite sad. It's like when I was in Jerusalem, the stupidest thing I ever did in my life. was make hummus for Palestinians and Israelis. What the hell was I thinking? I make black eyed pea hummus a lot of my kosher soul events because it's, it speaks to both sides of my identity. But when you're in Eretz Israel and folks are Israeli, Arab, Palestinian, and Jewish, it's like, what are you doing? So they can agree to hate you because it's like that's ours, and so these two gentlemen were there, and of course they were best friends and best enemies. One was a Palestinian chef, one was an Israeli chef, and they said to me in the same terse accent, Michael, so tell me, and who owns the hummus? And the Arab guy says, it's the Palestinian. And the Jewish guy says, it's the Israeli. And I gotta tell you something. This is the most bizarre moment of my life. Everybody on the street stopped. like they were about to do a mob dance or whatever. There was a hospital. Everybody who was about to die waited to die. There was a Muslim guy who was about to ride the buraq to heaven, to paradise. There was a Jewish guy who was about to see the blue light of Hashem's throne. There's a Christian woman who was ready to walk in Jesus' arms, and they all stopped dying just to hear my answer. And then down the street in Machne Yehuda, everything stopped. The birds stopped. And so I said, of course I'm sweating bullets, right? I'm not a rivulet of various Tigris, Euphrates, Nile, Yarden, all the rivers, right? And I look at them and I said, repeating their terse accent, who owns the hummus? The Jews, of course. And so all the Israelis smiled. He's like, he is real. He's a real Jew. Then I said, but of course, the Arabs really own the hummus. They all start cheering. That part of the story I'm not making up. Then I said, you're both wrong. I said, it doesn't belong to anyone in particular, it belongs to all of you because there was some woman living in ancient Sumer who was neither Jewish nor Muslim, neither Arab nor Jew, who had hungry kids. All she had was chickpeas, olive oil, and some garlic and said, eat this and go to bed. And you can thank that woman for hummus. And that's how Michael Twitty brought peace to Jerusalem for them. So people started dying. I saw angels taking people to heaven. The birds started flying, and the hostages kept arguing, and everybody was doing their thing. But in terms of a Southern context, it's like these are the same people, same cousins. Where do you draw those lines? When people watch television and movies, which is where unfortunately they get a lot of their information from about the South, they think that these two groups of people were always living on two separate sides of the street. Nothing could be further from the truth. You look at these pictures of black people who were enslaved or servants into antebellum families. And there's this one picture that's particularly galling and interesting to me, and it's of an enslaved woman who is literally suckling her child and the white child at the same time. And this is not an uncommon scene if you read the literature. The literature was black people and white people having a co-created culture. One where, quiet as it's kept, the lower on the rung of society that you were, and the more exposed you were, quite frankly, the more African you were. The past year I've been to Senegal, I've been to Ghana, I've been to Nigeria, reconnected with my African roots. And I can tell you something about white Southerners. They have far more in common with somebody from Ghana and Nigeria than they do from somebody from Scotland, Ireland, and England. They just don't know it yet, or maybe they do know it, and that's the damn problem. And it's the same thing we see in other parts of the world where people have always shared the same culture, but because of systems, power structures above and beyond them, have used arbitrary divisions to create nonsense. That's why I say race is an illusion, but food is a reality.
That is a good segue. I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to find one of my questions in that. Wow. You devoted a sizable part of that book on your DNA research, and I think you had about 13 different tests, like a good number.
Something like that.
A good number. So, what role do genes play in your story?
One of the reasons why I did that is because one of my major influences, one of mine, a whole multiple generations of people, Americans, period, but especially African Americans, was Alex Haley. And Alex Haley deserves a lot of credit. He wouldn't be on Ancestry.com or 23andMe without roots. Now, some people sit up there and they went after Alex immediately because they hated the idea of us reconnecting to our African roots. They hated the idea of us repairing this wound. They hated us declaring that we were not orphans of the West. That we were only made in America when we had 70,000 years of history predating Jamestown. So they went after Alex. They called him a plagiarist. Well, he wasn't working like when we work with computers. He was working with people helping him develop this project. I know the family, and his nephew, who is also black and gay, is one of the directors of African American research in Indianapolis, where his ancestor came through to America. So you got to make a lot of allowances for somebody who was working a different time and place. But they came after Alex Haley, and I decided that with this book, wasn't nobody gonna mess with me. You notice how I quickly go from Yiddish Shanakis to Ebonics. Because you can tell I'm getting frustrated, right? I'm like anger coming out right a little bit, because that's what we do when we get expressive. And I wanted people to take me seriously, and I wanted people to know that they were not going to call me a flake. If anything, if I said that my people came from Ghana, you were going to know. Because I know people. People be like, well, how do you know? How could you possibly know? What do you know about genetics? Well, African Americans are actually leading, not following, in terms of genetic genealogy, because we have the most to gain and lose. So it's our folks who are really, one of my friends I quote extensively in the book is, incredible amateur genetic genealogist. And he knows his stuff. He knows mitochondrial DNA from everything else and the whole process, more so than I do. But for me, it was important about making sure people understood that I was aware of, you notice in the book that I actually go through the time to say yes but no but yes. Because I wanted all the possibilities of pitfalls to be right there in front of the reader. So they understood that I understood that there are no solid answers. You have to look at the consensus, you have to look at history, context, all that goes into determining whether or not that test is accurate. It's not just the result that can or cannot be accurate. So that was really critical for me. And it was also critical in terms of saying, yes, I have a Jewish connection, but it's over here. And this is what it looks like on paper. Yes, I have this connection, this is what it looks like over here. And by the time I got done with all these different tests, there wasn't a part of the world where I didn't have relatives. And it got to me because I just thought to myself, we do all this, goodwill towards men and peace on earth garbage. We don't really mean it though. And if, your fellow American is a human being, you're part of the same human family, and you share the world with other human beings regardless of nationality, and you don't regard them as family, forget neighbor. Family. You say to people, I love my family, I cherish my family. Great. Cherish the fact that you have family that don't look like you, that don't share your phenotype, that are your blood and bone relative. That if you were standing before your common ancestor and you had to vouch for why you cussed them or why you fought them, and you saw the shame on their face because now they're watching their descendants fight one another, you would have that moment of self-reflection, say I shouldn't do that. So from now on I treat every human being, every stranger I meet, no matter what they look like, as if they're my potential family, because quite frankly they are.
Family, mishpacha. I'm thinking it might be interesting for people to hear you read a little bit from the mishpacha.
Sure. I read my whole book for the audio version. Wow. You know, I told them, I said it took 7 days, same time it took Hashem to make the world. Yeah, this is special to me because this is the launching pad for the, we'll talk later about it, but the next book, we'll talk about that later. But this chapter is, if I can set it up, it's because when I was selling this book, I was told, you cannot be a black gay Jewish author. You must simply be black. We cannot market you as black and Jewish. I'm like, hold up, I've been kosher soul for 3 years now. I've been doing my own thing, my own way. But I was told by one very, very well-known publisher, you're simply not marketable that way. You gotta keep it to be black, it has to be a black book only. And I said, well, I didn't write this book just through the lens of that one part of who I am. You know, without the Jewish lens, this book doesn't make sense. And the editor, the gatekeeping editor, had this nervous laughter, and she says, I don't think America's ready for you. And I said to her, baby, I am America. My America was greeting your America when you got off the boat at Ellis Island. I had been here for 300-something years. Who are you telling about America? And I said, furthermore, America is the only place where I'm possible. And I'm thankful to God for that. So, no. Do you know, that's the gay shade. And I said, do you? And it was my Sandy Koufax one because I was like, I was told, guys, you can't even wear a kippah in public. And I thought, that's really sinister. Because that's a kind of conversation that limits us as American Jews. It's a kind of conversation that enables people who are not Jewish to be able to say, see, they're really not about what they say they're about. And I refuse that. I taught kids about the Shoah, and I'm going to sit there and say, no, I'm not going to wear a kippah to make money? Anyhow, no, we don't do that. So this is a chapter called Mishpacha. It's about my relationship with Judaism and Jewish food, and it ties into other parts of the book. And I'll read the section that you pointed out. Okay, so I think there is still a lingering sentiment in the culture that sees Jewish food as a mass of things that go on rye bread. Cannot possibly pronounce without gagging or producing mucus, and are blessed by a rabbi and smell like fish, cabbage, harsh condiments, and crotchety old people. Some even read some sort of sinister Kabbalistic workings or blood libels into our recipes. I can tell you none of this is true. Jewish food is a matter of text expressed on the table. Entering the Jewish foodscape changed my life. Jewish and black food crisscross each other throughout history. They are both cuisines where homeland and exile interplay. Ideas and emotions are ingredients: satire, irony, longing, resistance. And you have to eat the food to extract that meaning. The food of both diasporas depends on memory. One memory is the sweep of the people's journey, and the other is little bits and pieces of individual lives shaped by ancient paths and patterns. The food is an archive, a keeper of secrets. One of the reasons I am madly, passionately, head over souls in love with Judaism is the unrestrained passion it has for questions, analysis, study, review, revision, and that dance, it seems, to revel in both tradition and intellectual anarchy. This process is not always done with a book. Sometimes it's lived out through folk and material culture and with food. The scriptures of Torah and Talmud give a uniquely Jewish life and law to what could just be a means to suppress hunger, and hours later, a reason to read a magazine for 10 minutes with your pants down. I love that almost the entirety of the Jewish people will sit down for a Seder and discuss and debate the ancient lessons of slavery versus freedom, while using an edible Torah to process those lessons in their bodies through all senses available to the eater.
Talking about Passover, which we, as we all know, just finished, we said in the Seders, in every generation, a person is obligated to see themselves as if they personally went forth from Egypt. That instruction, I would imagine, is very much in your mind during your day job.
Right.
When you are an interpreter at a historic Virginian plantation, and where you dress in the clothes that enslaved people wore and you cook by their
Right.
means. You also talk about going every year, almost on a pilgrimage, to pick cotton 16 hours a day by yourself to see what it's like. Can you talk about that connection?
Oh, absolutely. And today is a very special day because today was the day that the vast majority of enslaved people received their freedom. April 9th, 1865, the day of the surrender, was the actual emancipation day for the majority of enslaved people. And one of the things that I write about in my book is that my great-great-grandfather and his brother, he was named Elijah Mitchell, his brother was George, and they were present at Appomattox. They were enslaved in Appomattox County, Virginia, and they were right down the road when the surrender happened. And my great-great-grandfather remembered seeing the two generals, at the McLean farmhouse, shake hands, and the whole army was there. And at that moment, their former slaveholder, Blake Mitchell, told them they were free. At which point, my great-great-grandfather and his brother did the first horsejacking, and took the horse and rode down the road together, telling all the formerly enslaved people on the different plantations they were free. I like to think that my great-great-grandfather is one of the first people to know the nightmare was over. And not only that, but it was the eve of Passover, 1865. Yeah, a lot of stuff, deep stuff. So when I interpret slavery on different plantation sites, I'm an itinerant. I was the first revolutionary in residence at Colonial Williamsburg. Those things aren't natural. Those institutions went through a lot of issues to get to the point where they could interpret and accept that they should be treating the African American story as equal and essential, not subcutaneous and a whisper. They were still doing that at Monticello 10 years ago. And then thank God for DNA, because Maury Povich proved Jefferson was the father. And that was that. I mean, they could no longer ignore that, or the fact that for the vast majority, if your people were here before 1860, the chances of you having intertwined bloodline with African and Native people in one form or another, it goes way up. It's almost impossible. And I think we're still sort of fighting those battles, if we be honest with each other. That's part of our current, balagan, is that these conversations, issues, conflicts are still going on in our minds, bodies, and between each other. There is a certain America that understands this, but doesn't want to deal with it. But when I dress in those clothes, it's for the first time. It's very shocking. It's for some people, you got to remind folks that enslaved is the real identity, not slave. Slave wasn't nobody's job. You didn't get paid to be a slave. Slave wasn't an identity anybody wanted. Nobody in this room wants to be 3/5 of a person. Nobody in this room wants to be seen as an animal. Nobody in this room wants to be sold away from their children. Nobody in this room wants to be treated as if their bodies don't experience the same physical pain. Nobody in this room wants to be seen as less a human. So I would ask that from now on, when you talk about enslaved people, I don't care if they're modern, contemporary, or in the past, in any given century or time, please give them the human dignity and refer them as enslaved, not slave. Because slave wasn't nobody's identity. Enslaved is a condition, one's an identity. Get that just straight. So that's the first thing we got to talk about. The next thing we have to talk about is the fact that for African Americans who interpret slavery, this is a really deep deal. Because for us, we're educating people on multiple levels, but we get hit with stuff that other people don't get hit with. When I was interpreting at Williamsburg last year, I was there every month, one lady came in. She had a certain kind of hat on. It was a red hat. I'm not going to say anything further. And she said to us, 5 African American interpreters in one space. Oh, I know exactly what it was like to be enslaved and oppressed because I'm an evangelical Christian and we were oppressed like the slaves were. And you'd look on my face, I was 2 seconds away from saying, you better get on back in the big house where you still got a chance. I mean, who does that? Let me put it in context for you. Imagine if she said that nonsense at Auschwitz-Birkenau. How many of y'all be like, I'm taking you out of here personally? That's how we felt, but we couldn't go there. We had to educate her. We had to make it into a teachable moment. We still told her her rights. But my way of saying it. But we made it plain for her that was not appropriate. But no, she had no clue, no idea, no understanding. No. Her poor daughter looks so embarrassed. But not at our response, but at what her mother said, which I'm very proud of. But that's what it's like. And when you go pick cotton, it's like, to a lot of people it's a joke. But when you learn that 2/3 of America's export value, when you learn that ran the whole Industrial Revolution, that made it possible for immigrants from Europe to come over here and work in factories in the North. That the money that was in Boston and New York and Philadelphia and Buffalo and Chicago was running off of Southern cotton money. And that was only one crop that enslaved people grew and raised with free labor. And that the most valuable commodity in the American 19th century wasn't the cotton, it was the black body. When you learn all that, when you actually go through the ritual of picking cotton, which is the most, not the worst work, but one of the worst forms of work, because your hands get cut up by the birds, and you get splinters, and your hands bleed, and you have to stay down. You can't get up and come back. You have to stay down, and the sun is on your back, and you get sunburned, and you get dehydrated, and you begin to understand the debt that was paid so I could write a book. That not only my ancestors in slavery paid, but my daddy paid, and my grandfather, and his father, and his father, and his father, and his father, and his father. I'm not even one generation removed from picking cotton on a southern farm. And so for me, it's about really acknowledging where we come from. And so when I say the words, now we are slaves, I mean it.
I want to remind everyone about the cards to please write them down, and staff will come pick them up. Thank you for that, Michael. Relatedly, you use the phrase culinary justice throughout your book. And I was wondering if you could tell us what you mean by that, and what role can people in this audience today do to help achieve culinary justice?
Sure. This is why I say that it's important to value the Jewish lens, not only in my work, but in general. We don't give ourselves enough credit. Having various spectrums and lenses that come from a Jewish perspective, it's not so much when we're self-reflective. What does it matter if there's an Eruv to the rest of the world? What does it matter if we remember to count the Omer? Remember to count the Omer tonight. What does it matter? But when we use that lens and it helps the whole planet, we're actually doing tikkun olam. So for me, I have been Jewish for 21 years now, give or take. And one of the things two words that came up often were social injustice. Social justice. So I taught in Hebrew school 14 years, 6 different types of shuls and movements. And I did, if anybody's on the Nobel Prize Committee for Peace, 6th and 7th grade Hebrew school. Yeah. But I love my students, I really do, and I'm glad to see them growing and flourishing. I think that was the first time they ever heard the phrase, "You better go cut a switch." Not a very Yiddish phrase. But, I was working with what is my other rabbi's name? I have so many rabbis. Rabbi in Washington D.C. area. We'll come back to him. I'm having one of those senior moments. But he was really cool because he had a social justice farm that used to be a monastery. The synagogue community, he has two of them. One of them is basically, it's like a retreat center. And so Rabbi David and me would work together. We had this camp. He came up with a Buber camp, named after philosopher Martin Buber. And the kids would learn philosophy and learn Jewish studies. And then half the day we would work in this tzedakah garden over an acre. And the whole goal was to teach them about, gleaning and the importance of growing, contributing food, and being aware of your food. And so I started learning about institutions like Hazon and learning more about the role of social justice in everyday Jewish life, which of course has different implications depending upon Orthodox, conservative, reform, Reconstructionist, renewal, Havurah, independent Havurah, whatever your perspective is. And then I started learning about food justice. So the idea that access to healthy food should be a right, not just a privilege. That's affordable, that's available. We shouldn't take that for granted. It affects everything, from your ability to learn in school to your ability to graduate and have a life and also have healthy habits throughout your lifetime. So then my mind bounced from that to culinary justice. And the test of that was, I was in a panel one time, and this, my sister, if we say, African-American woman said to me, I think it's really elitist to talk about culinary justice when we don't have food justice. And I said, I'm sorry to hear that you feel that way, because if you're poor and all you have is rice and beans, and somebody jacks your rice and beans and takes the culture of that and the recipe of that and can use their privilege and their power to build an empire off of it, you still eating rice and beans and starving. You do need some culinary justice in your life. So the bottom line for me is I think a lot of people confuse diffusion and appropriation. Cultural diffusion is what happens in a healthy, multicultural society. We share, we interact, we're on the same playing field. Appropriation is when I take your stuff and you're not the better for it. It happens mostly between men and women. I mean, if you think about it this way, think about all those lovely food trucks. It's a bunch of dudes, and they're making comfort food. Better than mom made it. Hold up, but see, mama had 10 kids in her skirt talking about mom when she made that comfort food. So until you can duplicate that experience, I won't hear nothing from you, your testosterone, toxic masculinity self. It's the same thing for people of color when, it's like the place in Nashville that does the hot chicken. The Prince's versus whatever that spot that white boy owns. And I mean, everybody goes there because he's cute, and he has a tattoo of vegetables on his arm or something, and he has a beard, he's an honest to God hipster, and his ingredients are organic and sourced and handmade. What the hell do you think my grandparents did? You don't think they grew organic from the land? When they did it, it was just called poverty. When you do it, it's an art. Michigas. Going in. So how do you deal with that? And some people don't understand that part of what feeds culinary injustice is the inability to get that loan, to have a brick and mortar building, to have location. And a lot of times in the South, those, like in Charleston, New Orleans, those historically, designated areas they're segregated from black folks. Like, it was okay for you to cook in those places and serve people. It wasn't okay for you to own anything on that block to this day. So you don't have access to the same playing field. So the solution is that first we give credit where credit is due. Number two, we support folks of color in all aspects of the food industry. From food writing to restaurant owners, to chefs, to cooks, to professional caterers, all that. We give them their authority back. That's the first and most important thing. There you go, calling us bucks. You know, it's the only solution to whitewashing is black rooting. And also understanding where our stuff comes from. See, our history does not begin in 1619. History doesn't even begin in 1526, when the Spanish under Francisco de Ayllón brought the first shipment of Africans to what is now North America. They revolted in the only successful slave rebellion and won, and became the first non-native people to permanently settle this country. It doesn't begin then. It begins in West Africa 70,000 years ago. We're the most ancient human beings on the face of the planet. Our DNA says so. We've been here for that long. We've been here for that long, creating culture. It's on the rock walls in West Africa. It's in the people. I saw it from my own two eyes. And we need to understand that that's another part of the culinary justice thing, is restoring the honor and dignity to the narratives of food people around the world. Our story is just as beautiful and wonderful as anybody's story who comes from Tuscany or Provence or the Yellow River Valley in China. That's why I wrote it like I did. Because I didn't want to write another book. Another publisher wanted me to write a book where I was saying, there's an okra chapter, there's a watermelon chapter. I'm like, oh, really? Okra, black eyed peas, watermelons, and rice. Aren't you Negroes so nice? I'm not writing that book. But I wanted to write from the perspective of, this is my Mende 6th great grandmother from Sierra Leone. Even though I don't have her name, I know she existed. And I'm going to tell you how she brought the woman's knowledge of growing and processing rice, which made white males in South Carolina into 18th century millionaires. But not only that, but transformed the Low Country in such a way there was more land moved to build those rice plantations that was moved to build the pyramids in Egypt. You got to think about, it was the skills and knowledge in telling people that Africans arrived here empty-handed, not empty-headed. So they really get to understand the process. We weren't just labor. We weren't just brute. That's what I was taught in school, guys. I was taught we were unskilled labor from the jungle, heathens. I was taught this in the early 80s. That's what I learned in school. My parents were like, This is why we put those black kings and queens upon our children's walls. We have a responsibility to, because we want them to understand that narrative that they've often gotten from media and from school is not correct. So culinary justice is all of that. It's really understanding the food on the people's level. And Chris Shepard of Houston did something really great. What he would do is, he was influenced by all the cuisines of Houston, which is a multicultural city, right? And what he would do is he would say, you know what, yes, this is my version of pho. But if you want the real honest to God pho, go to my friend, the chef. He'll give you the address, tell you how to get there. And that was awesome, because he's saying, I am absorbing all of the opportunity Houston has to offer. But I want you to understand that after all the Vietnamese community has gone through to get here in Houston, after all they put up, the Klan used to be on boats off the coast of Texas to intimidate the Vietnamese fishermen. You know what I'm saying? Who does that? How do you beat that history back without giving that full credit and having that dialogue? So it's important people get that. Culinary justice is so critical.
I have some other questions as I go through these. Maybe give us a little bit of a peek into what your next book may be about. So
when people tell you that you're invisible, the best thing you can do is be as visible as humanly possible. I'm good at that. So I'm writing it. So basically, this book is part of a trilogy of food memoir. And the next book this book centered my African American identity, the South, slavery, genetics, genealogy, all that. And the story of food in the South, and African American food from Africa to America, from slavery to free. The next book centers my Jewish identity and food. And it's still going to be an African American Jewish narrative with, vacations to LGBT identity, and focusing on learning. You know, how does one learn this vast diasporic culinary tradition, but also how does one teach? Because I was a Hebrew school teacher for 14 years. And so I was both learner and learned, student and teacher. And then my third book of that trilogy is going to be about centered my LGBT identity and food. And it's important to understand all these books are gay stories. All these books are Jewish stories. All these books are African American stories. All these books are American stories. All these books are human stories. You shouldn't portion them out and say this is here and this is here. One thing I like to tell people is that we are all intersectional. That word does not mean the trans woman of color rabbi of your dreams. That's not describing that person. Intersectional is everybody in this room, because you are nowhere like your great-great-great-great-grandparents. They wouldn't recognize you. They wouldn't understand you. I don't care how hollow Judaism feels to you and how nothing's changed in 4,000 years. That's nonsense. They wouldn't recognize you. They wouldn't know how to deal with you. Not just because you're technology, because of who you are. How you speak, how you think. Let's be real about this. Nobody on the planet has that connection. Unless you live in the Amazon or New Guinea, and ain't nothing changed. The bottom line is, we have that. We have that dynamic identity. So if you are an American and you are not multicultural, you haven't tried hard enough to be an American.